What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and if you know me personally, or maybe you've been watching this channel for a while, or maybe you listen to my podcast, The Nerd You're Looking For, which is obviously a not so subtle reference to one of the more famous lines in the Star Wars franchise, you know I'm a big fan of Star Wars. I don't know if there's a point that I can remember in my life that I didn't consider myself a fan of Star Wars. And of course, since I do this channel, I'm obviously also a pretty big gamer. So if there's a Star Wars video game that comes out, especially a single player Star Wars video game that comes out, chances are I'm going to play it. And since I do this channel where I talk about a lot of video games and kind of give my thoughts on the video games that I play, I'm going to talk about it on this channel. And we got a big one last week with Star Wars Outlaws. And of course, since I'm doing this video, I've played it and I want to talk about it. So without further ado, let's rock. So the last few years, we've been getting a lot of Star Wars video games of all shapes and sizes. Of course, you have that multiplayer Battlefront games, but you also have the single player adventures like Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. Unlike Star Wars Outlaws, those games I just mentioned were actually published by EA. This game, on the other hand, was actually developed by Massive Entertainment, the studio behind the Tom Clancy Division games, and it was published by Ubisoft, which right off the bat, that's gonna turn some people off because Star Wars Outlaws is an open world game and Ubisoft has become kind of, especially recently, known for making some generic open world games, which we'll get to that later. That's called foreshadowing in the biz. Star Wars Outlaws did release on 8/30, but as it's kind of becoming a theme in video games, you can actually, if you buy the deluxe edition or collectors or whatever they call it, you can actually play this game a few days early, which I have been known to do that occasionally, especially with a game like Star Wars Outlaws that I knew I was going to play no matter what because I'm a big Star Wars fan. But I decided against it. I knew I was going to have a 4-day weekend with Labor Day. I had taken the Friday off that it came out. So I knew I was already going to have a 4-day weekend. So I was going to have plenty of time to play it. So I decided against paying the extra money to play it early, which I'm kind of glad I did that because, or I guess in this case didn't do that because I'd heard that it was pretty buggy in early access, so I'm kind of glad that I didn't pay extra money to essentially be a glorified beta tester. Now, Outlaws did drop on PS5, PC, and Xbox Series S and X. I played it on my Series S. And unlike the games I mentioned earlier, Star Wars Outlaws has nothing to do with Jedi or lightsabers. It follows Kay Vess, a loner trying to make a name for herself in the criminal underworld. However, when a job goes bad, she gets a death mark placed on her head and must take a second bite at that same heist apple in order to set things right. But first, she needs a new crew. And say what you will about the most recent Star Wars properties, I'm looking at you, Acolyte. I am still a massive fan of Star Wars. I've been a fan of the franchise my entire life, and I don't care. When Star Wars is at its best, it's still really awesome. And because I am such a huge Star Wars fan, Star Wars Outlaws had me smiling from ear to ear at times, especially in the last third of the game. Getting to break into Jabba's palace was an absolute dream. Unfortunately, you do have to take a lot of medicine to get to the fun stuff. It's chock full of all that open world filler we have seen in 1,000 other games before, especially with Ubisoft games recently. There's a lot to do in Star Wars Outlaws, but most of it isn't that fulfilling, unfortunately. And on top of that, despite being a fan overall of the character Kay Vess, I think they could have done a much better job at developing the characters around her. We're supposed to really care about her crew, especially her essentially partner, ND, and I just don't feel like they did a great job of developing the other characters outside of Kay Vess. But let's start with Kay as a character. First of all, I think she was played beautifully by Humberly Gonzalez. The voice work was especially good, by Gonzalez. So I definitely like the character a little bit more based on that performance. The game starts off with her getting roped into this big heist job with a crew she's never met before. It doesn't go well, so she is forced to steal a ship with her pet Mirqual and best friend Nyx. That ship that she steals is the one that you will use for the entire game, so it's not something that you can necessarily upgrade your ship or anything like that. You can upgrade the components of the ship, but it's not like a game like Starfield or Star Citizen or anything like that where you can get better ships as the game goes on. That's going to be the one that you use the rest of the game. After stealing that ship, she is reluctantly recruited to pull a mulligan, essentially, and try the same job again later with a different crew. However, most of this game is actually her going from planet to planet, recruiting the rest of her crew. And in order to keep Kay on her schedule, her benefactor leaves his bodyguard droid, ND5, to essentially babysit Kay, so he kind of runs things from that perspective. Kay, Nyx, and ND travel the solar system, recruiting each member of the new crew. And the game doesn't do much to let us know anything about Kay at first. We know she's an orphan. How and why she's an orphan is kind of a mystery, at least in the first part of the game. She lives upstairs from a bar ran by a bartender slash father figure who eventually gets hurt protecting Kay. So we know that she obviously has these really strong relationships, but we don't know a whole lot about her, at least early on in the game. We do get these flashbacks with Kay and her mother, but those are few and far between. And when I say far between, I mean it. Literally, you get the first one, I would say, in the first maybe 2 hours of the game. And then I think I might have played for close to 8, maybe even 10 hours before I got the next one. It was so far in between that I actually thought the game forgot about it. Like, I was like, oh, did they just introduce this flashback and we're never gonna get any more of this story? So that was a little confusing. I do think that there was some interesting stuff with her mother, like the idea of her not really being her mother and more of a criminal. She was kind of not teaching Kay like a mom, she was teaching her like a potential partner in crime sort of thing, and that she didn't need a crew leader, she needed a mother. And I thought that was really an interesting idea. It's not really well developed. They definitely left a lot of meat on the bone when it came to that storyline, and when eventually that story thread does pay off in this game, it felt hollow because I didn't feel connected to that relationship. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they didn't develop it, of course, but also there was just those long stretches in between the flashbacks. The game also wants you to feel something between Kay and ND, but they don't actually do the heavy lifting. There are moments where they will chat, especially when you're in hyperspace, but there isn't like this big moment in Star Wars Outlaws that I can point to now that I've beaten the game and I can say that's when they became partners. They are very reluctant partners through, I would say, 75% of this game. And then all of a sudden a light just kind of switches and they start to really care about each other. And again, I just didn't feel that connection because I didn't feel like they actually did the heavy lifting to make me believe that they're really developing this relationship. And I think a lot of that has to boils down to, as much as they make a big deal about ND being Kay's babysitter and being a very reluctant babysitter, he's not really with her for very long in the actual game itself. He's usually back at the ship chatting with her on comms, which I understand from a practical gameplay perspective. He's this giant droid enforcer. If you always had him with you fighting, you would kind of cruise through the game. But shared trauma is a powerful drug. So if you actually went through a lot of these missions together, I feel like I would believe that bond way more than I did in this game, which is a shame because the third act really hinges on their relationship. And if the game put more effort in building that relationship, I would have connected with the third act way more than I did. And one final note before we move on from the story, the villain was so obvious and his motivations were so dumb that it really put a sour taste in my mouth once you finally get those motivations and kind of get that turn with the character. Obviously, I'm not going to spoil anything, but it was pretty bad. They also shoehorned another villain in for like 30 seconds so hard that I thought I was going to have to go to the ER to get my eyes unrolled. But that's coming from an OG Star Wars fan. There's probably a chunk of people playing this game, or at least considering playing this game, that don't care about Star Wars as much as I do. They just want a cool open world space game. And Star Wars Outlaws, to its credit, does have that in spades. It reminded me, for better or for worse, playing Starfield, just kind of in a Star Wars wrapping. Now, I'm not saying that Star Wars Outlaws has the depth of Starfield. It certainly doesn't. But the core gameplay felt very similar. Again, you're kind of just hopping around the solar system in your spaceship looking for work. The space travel felt very similar to Starfield, with a few less menus. There's still menus. Takeoff and landings are still cutscenes, just like Starfield. But once you actually got past that, and you can call me biased if you want, I probably am to a certain extent, but I had way more fun flying around in the galaxy in Outlaws than I ever did in Starfield. The flying felt way more fluid, and it felt like there was way more to do in space when you're actually in space in Outlaws versus Starfield. I also never got tired of punching my ship into hyperdrive. But again, typically when you're flying around, you're looking for work from all these criminal syndicates like the Crimson Dawn, among others, in between recruiting members of your crew, because that's the main goal, is you want to get all the members of your crew and then eventually try that same heist that you failed at the beginning of the game. But you also have to make some money while doing that. So you have to find all these jobs from all these criminal factions. And throughout the game puts a lot of emphasis on managing the relationships with those criminal factions. Each syndicate has their own jobs and contracts that they'll offer you. However, those jobs and contracts don't happen in a vacuum. Often you will do a job for one syndicate that directly goes against the wishes of another. Sometimes you will even get to the end of a job and you can choose which deal to stick to or who to stab in the back. Each syndicate will also have their own territory, and if you're good with that group, then some jobs will be easier than others because you can just kind of come and go as you please in that territory, while other syndicates will literally shoot you on sight if you have a bad relationship with them. And if they don't like you, then you're going to have to find another way into the base or area by kind of sneaking or platforming around. More on both of those here in a second. Just a word of advice, free advice for anyone trying to build a crime family and looking to find a spot to post up at. Maybe you don't put your secret hideout right next to clearly climbable walls, because I'm going to come and rob you. I'm going to climb those walls, I'm going to get past your guards, and I'm going to rob you. Your standing with these factions in Star Wars Outlaws can even affect the vendor prices when you want to buy or sell something. My cheapness, even in video games, cannot be underestimated. I literally would fly to different planets in Star Wars Outlaws just to get better prices when I wanted to sell my tchotchkes. I do want to give the developers a lot of credit, because I do think that they did a great job making sure that you had to interact with all the factions. A lot of times when you sign up for a job with one faction, you will find out that another syndicate wants that same MacGuffin that you're getting for one other syndicate. The game does a really good job of manufacturing conflict between these syndicates, and they're kind of putting you in the middle of these conflicts. I play a lot of games, so I just assumed this game would be a lot like the others that I've played, where I could just avoid anyone who wasn't a member of the K-Vest fan club. But in Star Wars Outlaws, they kind of make it mandatory to interact with everyone, even if you don't get along with that faction. And if you don't get along with one faction or another, when you have to go into their territory, it will involve doing it pretty quietly. You're definitely going to have to do a lot of stealth and a lot of sneaking around. And that brings me to a core gameplay mechanic in Star Wars Outlaws. When you boil this game down, you have 3 gameplay foundations. You have stealth, you have, of course, combat, mostly blaster combat, and platforming. So I will start with stealth in Star Wars Outlaws. If you've ever played a game where you have to do a quiet takedown, and by that I mean where you kind of crouch walk behind someone, press a button when prompted to knock them out, you will cruise through the stealth parts of this game. Because that's what it kind of boils down to. There's a lot of just crouch walking and then coming up behind somebody and knocking them out. And those are the stealth parts of this game. And there are a lot of stealth sections in this game. Unfortunately, they didn't just stop at one video game stealth trope. This game kind of has them all. There's long grass to hide in that makes you essentially invisible, even though I'm pretty sure that they'd be able to see you even if you were in the long grass. I mean, honestly, enemies need to see their optometrist if their eyesight is really that bad. But yet, they have the worst eyesight I've ever seen in a video game, but yet they seem to have excellent hearing. Even if you consider not slowly crouch walking around them, they're gonna hear your footsteps. It's super, super frustrating. The stealth in this game is equal parts boring because it's so tropey, but also super, super frustrating. I do want to give them slight credit. You will eventually unlock different outfits that will help kind of cancel out some of the issues you have with the stealth stuff. So the stealth does get a little less frustrating as you go along in the game, assuming that you unlock the apparel necessary. Also, Nyx can be super helpful during these stealth sections. He can help you distract guards and cameras. He can also sabotage alarms and turn off cameras. And it's also super helpful because while they almost always hear you, if you're not crouch walking, they almost never seem to hear him, which is surprising because he's always making noise. He can actually even help you sometimes with those takedowns I mentioned earlier. I will say, and this is kind of a small nitpick, I wish that you could drag enemies to hide them, because it does happen occasionally in this game where you'll knock out an enemy and you just kind of quietly lower them to the ground, and then another enemy will see them. Even though they can't see you when you're in the long grass right in front of them, they can see somebody from across the map laying down. Dragging enemies that are unconscious or dead into like the long grass or putting them in a dumpster or whatever has kind of been a staple of stealth games for a while, and I was surprised it wasn't included in Outlaws, especially because they crammed a lot of stealth video game tropes in this game. So I don't understand why they wouldn't put this one in there as well, especially if the other enemies are gonna notice the guy just kind of laying down. And if that sounds awful to you and you're just like, well, I'm just gonna not do the stealth, I'm just gonna go hot all the time, I'm sad to report this game actually has forced stealth. There are sections, especially early on in this game, where if you get noticed, it's an immediate fail. Now, it does get better as the game goes along. For example, there are missions later on that, as long as you just don't set off an alarm, you'll still pass. Speaking of going hot, I said earlier that there are no lightsabers in this game, but there are plenty of blasters. You have a blaster right from the beginning of the game, and while you can pick up other guns from enemies for limited use, you will most likely use your blaster 99% of this game. Tiny note about the other guns: anytime that you interact with anything else, she drops that extra gun. So good luck trying to take it with you to another area after you pick it up. And as far as the actual gameplay is concerned, it's pretty typical third-person shooter stuff here. It always kind of feels like you're just crouching behind cover, waiting for them to poke their stupid head out, and then shooting them once they do that. But like I said with the hyperdrive, I'm just kind of a sucker for Star Wars, and so I never got tired of just shooting my blaster. Which, it's good that blasters don't have ammo, because I felt like I was constantly blasting Frank Reynolds style. So it was nice that I didn't have to manage ammo or anything like that. However, because it's a blaster, it does overheat. So you will have to get good at pressing the appropriate button when the time comes, or you're going to burn your hand and then you're going to get absolutely wrecked in a gunfight. You can, of course, upgrade your blaster with different mods that come in handy. There's one early in the game, it actually might be the first one you get, that literally just shoots out a burst of electricity that can be used to take down cameras or energy shields. You also get this powerful bolt shot later in the game that can take down stronger enemies easier, and a few others in between. You can also upgrade your blaster by buying parts from vendors and working on it at a workbench in your ship, kind of like The Last of Us. If you've ever played those games, it's a very similar upgrade style. I should also mention that your ship and speeder are also upgradable in a similar process, minus the workbench, of course. There are particular vendors that will work on your speeder and ship. I also want to point out a quick note about upgrading in general in Star Wars Outlaws. This game has a pretty weird skill tree where you don't actually get XP. If you do missions, you only get credits or syndicate reputation from completing those missions. How you actually upgrade Kay Vess and her ability and her character in general is by completing missions for particular characters, and they actually unlock a skill tree of sorts based on that character. You can only upgrade your abilities with that character's skill tree by completing certain tasks, like jumping your speeder a long distance or performing a X number of silent takedowns, etc. The skill tree in Star Wars Outlaws isn't anything completely unique. I've seen it before, but it's just odd going from a game last week like Black Myth that had a very traditional skill tree to Outlaws that kind of did it in a goofy way. And finally, the last core gameplay mechanic is platforming. And longtime viewers are probably already rolling their eyes because they already know what's coming, but I love platformers. It's easily my favorite genre. And since I'm talking about it last in the little gameplay segment of this review, then you could probably guess I wasn't super impressed by it. Because trust me, if I really loved the platforming in this game, because I love platforming so much, that's my favorite genre of video games, I'd be yelling from the rooftop about how cool the platforming is in Star Wars Outlaws. It's not that it's bad, it's just really basic. They make your every move so obvious. There are literal signs, and I'm not saying literally for an effect. There are literal signs that you may not notice at first because they are kind of small, but once you see the first one, you can't miss them. And they will literally, and again, I'm not using literally for effect, I mean it literally, these signs will point you in the right direction. So if you don't know which direction to go, look for one of these signs and it will literally point you in the right direction. I found it insulting to my platforming intelligence that they felt like they needed to put signs to point me in the right direction. Now, the actual act of platforming in this game was fun, especially Kay's grappling hook. I did find that kind of fun. I just wish I didn't have to shut my brain off during these sections because they were so easy. But personally, I was able to overlook some of the platforming and open world tropes because this game itself looks so good. You spend a lot of time running around cities, kind of chopping it up with people, and the amount of detail in these cities are amazing. The developers really went above and beyond creating this world, and it looks beautiful. You're constantly running into the different alien races in Star Wars. You can casually just walk by some stormtroopers harassing a shopkeeper. You can pet all the different animals that you come across. As an animal lover, I love when they allow us to do that. You can even eat street food made by a droid with your buddy Nix. You can play the Star Wars poker game Sarlacc, which not quite as fun as playing Gwent in Witcher 3, but it's pretty damn close. There's also a very cool and notable Star Wars character that has his own Sarlacc storyline that I absolutely loved. The developers really understood how critical it was to nail the feel of Star Wars in this open world, and it was easily my favorite part of this game. But that's just the cities. Even when you're outside of the cities, you have your trusty speeder bike, which was an absolute blast to ride. The bike, again, is also upgradable, even though I didn't find the upgrades outside of the one that allows me to go over big bodies of water to be all that helpful. You can even get into shootouts while you're on your bike that I, again, like the blaster fights and the hyperdrive. I never got tired of pulling off a shootout on my speeder bike. There is fast travel in Star Wars Outlaws, but outside the jungle planet, I found really annoying to ride around on my bike. I didn't do much fast travel because I really just enjoyed riding around on my speeder most of the time and just kind of taking in the environments. And that level of detail extends to the cutscenes as well. I've mentioned Starfield, and again, I don't want to keep shitting on that game, but I was really disappointed in that game's cutscenes and how they looked just old. They looked outdated. And while Star Wars Outlaws isn't going to come close to something like Cinema Saga or Callisto Protocol, what I consider top tier as far as fidelity in video games is concerned, or anything like that, they are well done. And kind of what I was talking about last week with Black Myth, we've gotten to the point in 2024 where I kind of just expect video games to look good. It's kind of like animated films. We've gotten to the point where the technology is just so good that I expect most video games to look good. So I'm kind of looking for these like little details that set certain video games apart. And at one point I noticed it, and I guess I just didn't notice it because the character didn't have very many close-ups until this part, but they gave one character 2 different colored eyes. They didn't have to do that. Somebody had to work to do that. And it doesn't really make that much of a difference, but just that added layer of detail is something that I really appreciated. All right, so kind of wrapping up, I do think that Star Wars Outlaws is kind of the perfect test case for how much, as an amateur video game critic, I'm willing to kind of overlook based simply on how much I love Star Wars. There are a lot of tropes of a lot of different genres kind of crammed into this game. None of them are necessarily bad. I've just seen them in 1,000 other games, which is exactly what makes them tropes. Star Wars Outlaws kind of feels like a video game that's a jack of all trades, master of none sort of thing. It almost kind of reminded me a lot of that famous Ron Swanson quote, "Don't half-ass 2 things, whole-ass 1 thing." And it feels like Star Wars Outlaws tried to half-ass a bunch of different things, and it just all kind of made it mediocre. But all that being said, I still had fun with this game, pretty much based solely on how much I love Star Wars and how much time and effort the developers put into absolutely nailing the feel of the Star Wars universe, which is great because they phoned in a lot of the other stuff. And similar to a game that I talked about last week, Black Myth, Outlaws, because it has a lot of tropey and very mediocre stuff, especially early on in the game, it took me a while for that light to go off. But as soon as it did, I just couldn't get enough of this game. And I kind of cruised through the last half of it just because I just wanted to keep playing it because it was a lot of fun as a Star Wars fan. But as a video game critic, I can't overlook those things too much. So I am only going to give it 3 stars, even though I did have a lot of fun, especially with the last, I would say, 10-ish hours. So this game is probably going to take you around 20-ish hours. I've seen as short as about 15, but I feel like that's just literally just doing the main missions, which is only like 1/3 of what this game is offering anyways. Like, you're not even doing any sabacc stuff, which I think again was really, really fun. So I think anywhere from about 20 to 30 hours is probably what most people are gonna play. And as far as paying full price, I would say just go ahead and wait. Do not pay full price unless you're a huge Star Wars fan like myself. But even then, I think that this game has enough warts that I wouldn't feel good suggesting that people pay full price for it. But of course, as always, those are just my thoughts on Star Wars Outlaws. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. Did you like it? Did you dislike it? Why not? Let me know in the comments down below. Of course, since you've made it this far in the video, I'd assume that you liked the video. If you did, do me a huge favor. It's quick, it's easy, it's free. Smash that like button, as the kids like to say. It just, again, is a quick and free, easy way to tell YouTube that you enjoyed this video, and they should push it on to other people that might like this as well. Also, if you enjoyed this video, definitely consider subscribing. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. That way you're notified every time I post another video. I try to post weekly gaming related content. So if you like that content, which again, obviously you do, you've made it this far in the video, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next week, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy, and we were just talking and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?